radicalisation is a term that's become very popular recently, linked directly to terrorism. The term radical itself is pretty benign and is applied to university students and government even, and radical reforms are being proposed all the time. But the term violent radicalisation is always linked to terrorism. And in particular, since 7/7 and 9/11, it's been particularly focused on Islamist militant groups rather than all sorts of violent extremism that take place by, for example, right-wing parties. Violent radicalisation has become a particular popular narrative because it's thought to explain a new phenomena, and that is individuals who've grown up with all the benefits of education, safety, security, support, communities, facilities, leisure facilities, sports facilities. Individuals who have grown up in this environment and suddenly decide they're going to attack people in this environment and attack and kill citizens in this environment and attack the environment and society itself and the state. This difficulty of understanding who within us is an enemy has caused a bit of a moral panic, and I think that's why the term violent radicalisation has received such popularity, because it ostensibly explains something that is very difficult to explain, why somebody like us can become violent and become a terrorist. Actually, what do we know about violent radicalisation and the process? Most of the knowledge we have about it has been gleaned from biographies of convicted terrorists and from the history books looking at terrorism not related to Islamist groups, and then inferring what happens during this imagined process of violent radicalisation. There's very little empirical evidence, actually. So we've been involved with colleagues in Carif and in the Cultural Consultation Service trying to understand what this process involves. One of the earliest stages is the development of sympathies for violent protest and terrorist groups. I accept that having sympathies is not the same as committing a terrorist act, but nonetheless it's the first phase in which one might become vulnerable to recruitment to terrorist organisations or violent extremist groups. And so we've been looking at how sympathies relate to particular individual and community characteristics. Although the data are currently being looked at and analysed and will be reported shortly, essentially we know that individuals growing up in isolation from their families or from benign and positive social influences are vulnerable to being recruited to all sorts of extremist causes, and violent radicalisation is no different. That if they are vulnerable and perhaps particularly at times of maturation or rapid changes in their lives, that they are isolated, adolescence, when people are leaving home, when they're changing educational establishments, that these are the particular times that people are vulnerable, particularly if they don't have the self-esteem and ability to consider and reflect on ideas and to critically appraise whether they are voluntarily joining a particular cause or protest group, or whether they're being enticed or encouraged, and in return they're getting a group identity, a more potent group identity often, friends, even love and affection from the in-group. And once in there, it's very hard to exit because it means giving up a whole set of relationships and supports that perhaps they hadn't had before. We also know that those who have come out of terrorism or radicalised influences, as well as those going into it, have reported that part of the problem is that they're quite disconnected from their culture of origin. They're told that they're following fundamentalist religious orthodoxies, but actually when you look at what they're being taught in some of the more radical groups, they're not orthodox at all in terms of Islam and what it teaches. And one of the interventions has been to provide more authentic knowledge of religion for these young people. Many of them don't speak Arabic, and so they take at face value what they're told by some of these charismatic leaders. And if they were given authentic knowledge, they might actually realise that some of the radical groups that they think are friends are actually not their friends, and they're being led to commit atrocities as well as possibly kill themselves in a sacred cause that actually they know very little about, in fact.